Lucie Middlemiss, who's Professor of Environment and Society at the University of Leeds. And she's worked for many years on issues of sustainability and its interaction with social justice and inequalities. So I think without further ado, Lucie, I'm going to hand straight over to you so we can hear about your current or the project that you're going to talk about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So before I start, I mean, there's a lot of names on this screen, and I wanted to make sure that they were properly credited. I'm the one with the star because I'm the speaker, but the rest of the team is also listed there. The project that I'm talking about today was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, led by the Young Foundation, by Institute for Community Studies. And Carolyn Snell, and I were the kind of academic leads on this. And I'm really presenting the two papers we wrote out of it, which were around some thinking that we've done around how to design a socially inclusive transition to net zero, and a sort of more data-oriented paper talking about the concerns people have about this transition when we presented it to them kind of through some workshops early on in the year. The funding for this ended ages ago. But we kind of our outputs are still ongoing, and I'll mention a book that we will have coming out next year at the end. And I'll also mention the Just Centre, which Ian's already referred to, but I'll talk about that a little bit more right at the end of the talk. So today I'm going to be talking about the sort of background and rationale of the project, which is about who's vulnerable in the net zero transition, what can we do about it. The key focus here is about how life will change under net zero, how that's shaped by current inequalities, and how can we address this agenda more inclusively. And to do that, I'll be talking about the conceptual framework that we've come up with for just participation in net zero, and that's also published in a paper.
I just wanted to quickly get the title and the names.
Oh, there's somebody that's unmuted there. Is it Tom?
Oh.
Maybe he realizes. Yeah. So sorry. So I'll start by introducing the conceptual framework and then offer some insights from the various the data that we gathered in the project, and then finish by talking about the sort of challenges and opportunities for policy. I think it's quite an interesting way of thinking because we're really bringing together ideas from social inclusion writing and the environmental agenda, and hopefully that's what you'll get out of the talk today. So to start with the sort of background, really, we when we were doing this work, we were kind of faced, really kind of faced with this cost of living crisis, and we articulated this as a sort of looming crisis behind the cost of living crisis, the climate crisis, and as an existential threat to humanity, as I'm sure many of you know. The UK has active policy commitments in the area with legally binding targets. We noted a long-standing concern about the need to balance social and environmental policy objectives, a sort of need for a just transition, which is embedded in international policy agreements like the Paris Agreement, and where there's an increasingly broad literature on this academically. But despite this, we felt that justice in the transition to net zero was largely missing from national UK policy frameworks, and also that the academic work in the area was fragmented, theoretical, or very specific. So tends to focus on one area, let's say housing or transport, rather than thinking about the change as a whole. In response to this, we set up a project which recognised that specific socioeconomic and demographic groups will be disproportionately burdened in the transition to net zero, that families on low incomes in poor housing with poor access to service are particularly at risk, that the impact of a net zero transition will vary regionally, and in various studies on this, there's particular concern for Yorkshire and the north of England, which ended up being our empirical study site. And so in recognising all of this, we come to our key research questions were around how do we conceptualise socially inclusive net zero transition in order to address these concerns, but also what do people who will be affected by this know about net zero and think about net zero? So what are their perspectives on things? As a result, we took these key kind of 4 steps. One of them was reviewing the literature to understand what's already known. It was an extensive literature review. We read as you saw, we're a big team, and we read something like 550 items of either academic research or from the grey literature. We developed a framework to help conceptualize this ability to participate in net zero. We tested it in these participatory community-based workshops that was very much led by the Young Foundation to develop a co-produced revised version of the framework, and then further tested that with a wider set of stakeholders. And that's the outputs of all of this activity and what I'll talk about today. So the conceptual framework, which we have published in the Journal of Social Policy and Society, here, the first part of our work really involved characterising the various areas of life in which people face changes. And what we did was we took all the published scenarios on net zero, which have been produced by policymakers, academics, also by Citizens' Assembly, principally though from the climate change and energy world, right? So not these are not very socially deep necessarily interpretations, and this is kind of the table summarizes everything. So don't worry about reading all the detail here. I'll kind of pull bits of this out. The first point to make here is how broad this is. So we're expecting changes across all these different areas of life as we characterize them on the left-hand side. They're our terms. So where we live, where we go, what we do for work, what we eat, what we do for fun, and what we spend our money on. So if we take a few of these, for instance, where we live, the sort of building transformation associated with that is something of a regular topic of concern, a lot of concern about who pays for that, who does it. What we do for work, there's the concern around closing down some industries and starting up others. We know how that's gone in the past, particularly for the north of England. What we do for fun, the idea that people will be staying local to socialise, people, less flying around, and so on. The social consequences of all of this, I think, are really huge. And one of the things that we want, one of the major things that we want to kind of put across here is that this is a transformative social programme that reaches into much of everyday life. And what that also means is it will affect different people very differently according to the way they currently live their lives, but also according to their needs for different services. And for people working on social policy or sociology, I think it's really important that we get into thinking about this, because I mean, effectively, it's like a planned change of a really large order of magnitude, I think, and that doesn't always come across in the way that we talk about this. And I think we need to be thinking about that and also studying it from a social perspective. Given that we can see that net zero change will affect people differently, we also then need to start where people are in the present. And this is something that we know a fair amount about. So, for example, we can map the present impacts of the different areas of life we identified from a carbon perspective. And my colleague Anne Owen produced carbon footprints of our different areas of life across income deciles in the UK. So the key messages from this chart is that the distribution of carbon footprint across income deciles is uneven. Poorer households have low carbon footprints because they have less opportunities to consume, less opportunities to move around. And for the record, that's a really well-known pattern in the environmental social sciences, right? And it holds across countries, between countries, so poorer nations, lower carbon footprints, and richer people in poorer nations, higher carbon footprints than poorer people in poorer nations. Some of these elements that we identify, the spending power, what we do for fun, etc., are less distinctively different. So, for instance, if you look at the bottom, the blue chunk at the bottom where we live doesn't actually vary much across deciles. And that tends to be to do with people spending more time at home when they're on lower incomes. That might be people on pensions or out of work. It can also be that houses at the bottom end of the income scale are less efficient. And so more energy is needed in order to bring them up to similar or, to create any kind of heat and so on. And then the third point to make about this is that the average, which is the final bar on the right-hand side, will need to come down to meet carbon targets. So in other words, all of this needs to reduce in some way. We're facing similar problems across deciles, but those on the lowest incomes are likely to be the least able to act. So we need to kind of both recognise the lower impact now, but also find ways of supporting people in change under net zero. And from a different study, actually, this is something we published a bit in 2021, led by Diana Ivanova, and using EU data, we can also see other factors shaping that distribution of access to opportunity to consume, which in turn leads to carbon footprint, or in this case, energy footprint. So in this study, we were looking at households across the EU, and specifically comparing households where there was a disabled person that was unemployed or not economically active, with other kinds of households. We're calling these disabled households for short, but it does mean disabled and where someone's not economically active. And you can see that in the figure A, B, and C, there's just a sort of general relationship between first income distribution, disabled and inactive households earning less than the other types. Then spend, so what people are able to spend on life in general, and then the third one is energy use. And so there's a sort of relationship that says that if you have an economically inactive disabled person in your household, the likelihood is that you will earn less, consume less, and use less energy. Critically, also, we see really different patterns of consumption in those households. So, for instance, less spend on leisure, less spend on travel, not much more spend on household energy in the home, which suggests that despite likely having additional needs, people are not necessarily meeting those needs. So we know then from these two slides that kind of there's a real variety of experience in homes with regards to what energy they're accessing currently, and what kind of lifestyles they're living currently, which then translate into the carbon or energy footprints. So moving on from this, then we kind of start to think about, well, what does a socially inclusive net zero look like? What is it that will allow different people and places to really get involved in this agenda? What kind of interventions are needed for different people and places, and what kind of support is needed in order to ensure this can happen? And the two key terms we've come up with in relation to this is that we think the transition needs to be person-centered. So that means articulating net zero, understanding it from the point of view of the household, and that's why we use the language that we do here, simple, approachable language, in order to be able to pull people in and talk to them about these kinds of things. We're interested in how these different parts of life work independently. So, for instance, where we go, what travel opportunities are available to people in particular places, but also how they work in conjunction with other areas of life. So, for instance, where someone lives might also be where they work and eat. And so dealing with these things entirely separately is kind of unrealistic. And then transition is also needs to be place-based, because place and the sort of infrastructure and the services available in place end up shaping really substantially what people's ability is to engage in the agenda. And there is various aspects around the north-south divide, peripherality, centrality of where you live, rural-urban divides as well, which really can have a big impact on how people are able to engage in this. So the simplified version of our conceptual framework, which we developed after reading all these papers and doing a lot of thinking, is effectively a list of critical questions to help us conceptualize this a more inclusive policy. And so we look at first, how do existing inequalities shape people's lives? So with a view to starting in the present and with an eye to righting past wrongs, because I think that's a really important part of the way we see things. Then looking at how how lives will change under net zero, and I've kind of shown you that through the various, where do people live, where do we live, where do we go, etc. Looking across all of those areas of everyday life, social life, home life, work life. We then think about what risks of exclusion this presents and for whom, and noting that risks vary for different people in different places, and then try and identify opportunities for inclusive policy. And we finished this project feeling like inclusivity is absolutely critical in net zero. Not just having talked to all these people in Leeds and Newcastle, I'll talk about in a minute, but and kind of talk them through these changes and thought through, well, what will this mean for them? But also, I suppose, in response to the sort of more political responses to this, the anti-net zero movement, which is sort of trying to derail the whole process by saying this is not going to work for people on low incomes, and we need to take that on effectively in order to and we need to take it on partly by doing better climate policy, more inclusive climate policy. Just for the interest of those in your institute, I think particularly one of the way that we've kind of the main kind of academic literature we're building on here is the Bristol Social Exclusion Matrix. So we kind of recategorize or took on the types of adult participation that Levitas et al. Come up with for in BSEM, and we've reframed them to consider participation in net zero, changing them slightly along the way. So, for example, the economic participation is very much around consumption and how people live their lives, and how they spend money on living their lives and make economic decisions around that, as opposed to employment, which we've moved into employment, education and skills, because that all kind of links together really, really strongly in the net zero agenda, around people having access to new forms of work through retraining, and also being able to engage in new lifestyles that are proposed under these changes. For me, the social participation is really interesting, actually, because from an environmental social science perspective, we really don't think about this. So people needing to continue their social lives in the context of likely localization of leisure, work and family, and the sort of knock-on impacts on people who are immigrants, or even who are just live away from family within country, are really interesting and important. And then the last one being around political and civic participation, people needing to have a say on this, how it's formed, how it's implemented, and that's something actually that the environmental literature is really hot on, and there's a lot of work on political inclusion, but it's kind of good to be reminded that needs to be there as part of the way of envisaging the change. And our bigger framework is here, but I'm not going to go through it now because I'm going to pull bits out of this as I go on through the talk. So moving on to the sort of empirical paper that we wrote out of this, which really is concerned with thinking about what shapes people's ability to engage. And I haven't said much about what we did empirically. So first, just to say that we worked with 7 neighbourhoods in Leeds and Newcastle, running workshops in each location. So we spent 3 hours in each location 3 times, with lunch, with participant compensation, in quite an intensive experience, I think, for people, and also for us in running this. And this was the Young Foundation were really critical here. They did an amazing job of both recruiting and running these, designing kind of very interactive events for people. The 3 kind of focus points were learning about net zero and about the local and about the local place. So them learning about net zero often, and us learning about their local place and what the services that existed there. Secondly, understanding local transition and people's abilities to engage. And then thirdly, understanding industrial transition and people's ability to participate in this. So the sort of overall approach was to kind of present this change to people, and then understand and then hear from them what their kind of reaction to that change was. It was a really, really productive and interesting piece of work for me. Created a huge amount of data, including visual data, recordings, notes, etc., which we analysed using framework analysis with this broader project team. And the 3 things that we kind of identified that really shape people's ability to engage is what I'm going to present next. The image on screen is the sort of to show the diversity of the sample. And we did have a really, really nicely diverse sample, including so that kind of presents across the whole sample. We within each of the locations, we also tended to always have, for instance, somebody from an ethnic minority, at least one or two in a group of around 15 in each place, people with disabilities. So we were talking, and people from different age categories, everyone identified as being on a low income. So that was the kind of starting point for recruitment. And we didn't recruit around environmental interests. So these are people that were just based in neighbourhoods and that wanted to talk about the future of those neighbourhoods effectively. So the three key themes that I'll talk about in relation to the empirical work is place, local services and infrastructure, house and home, and money. And we think those are the things that really shaped whether people could engage or not. So I'll just go through those in turn. So in terms of what shapes people's ability to engage, the first thing we really comes up strongly is place, local services and infrastructure, which is about where people live, the associated services, transports and other infrastructure that serve that place, and the employment available in that place. And in the picture you can see we've asked people to kind of map their area, and the text that you can see there, in case you can't read it, it says library reduced hours makes it difficult to access, and swimming pools closed down recently, now have to travel further. Generally, we kind of captured this sense of a crumbling local infrastructure in the wake of austerity, which is particularly important in communities that don't have much, but also where people can't afford to travel out so easily. And this links in really clearly to the sort of experiences of COVID-19 lockdowns, I think, when, you know, if you lived in a nice place, it was fine. If you lived in a place where there was, you just felt hemmed in by where you were, it was much more challenging. And we have this really nice quote from a participant here, which we use all the time because it's so sort of emblematic of the experience. This is about the sort of tensions between the ambitions we're profiling on net zero and then her life experience. And she says, when you come from a deprived estate and you're living on the breadline, obviously I feel my resistance to give up our car. If I did give up the car, it would significantly have a massive impact on our children. It's basically what we can do for them. Things like being able to participate in school sports clubs, in after school clubs. The fact these things aren't on your doorstep, and you do need to be able to toddle about to give them life skills and opportunities. For context, Leeds is one of the biggest cities in Europe. It is the biggest city in Europe that doesn't have a proper kind of mass transit system. We just have buses. They're shocking. I'm a bus user myself that is regularly disillusioned with life as a result. But also it's about this particular neighbourhood she's in. So she was talking about having to travel to two neighbourhoods round the ring road effectively, where the pool is, and you know, like being able to actually get there was the only way really realistically that she could do that was by car. So city living is not the same everywhere, I suppose. The second key theme was around house and home. Here we're talking about the quality or state of repair of the home, people's ability or inability to change it, how it's used, who lives there, and what their practices and preferences are. The picture is a boiler I came across in some other research some years back in someone's house. It was in social housing, and they were told it was from the 1960s. This is only in the 2010s that I was doing the research. But that sort of it's intended to kind of point out that, you know, we live in quite a crumbling housing infrastructure actually in the UK, and that people were facing all these issues associated with being tenants and being just being on a low income and owner occupied in some cases, and then not being able to, as a result, really engage with some of this stuff. And the quote here is from one of our participants who was in a tower block in Leeds, which was poorly insulated, cold, drafty, all the rest. And it's really to emphasize that homes shape all sorts of activities. So in this case, she was working from home, and she says that's probably going to be quite hard in winter. And I'm thinking of relocating to the library a lot of times just because it's in the flat with a hoodie on. So the interviews the workshops were being done around the time of it was in 2022, just as the energy crisis was kind of escalating, and so people were looking forward to the winter with this sort of sense of anticipation and anxiety. And this is one example of that. the third key theme of here is money, and I kind of left this out till last on purpose because I think the others are equally important, and obviously money is wrapped up in place and home as well. But here the we're talking about people not being able to make investments, the high and upfront costs of anything, making choices impossible, people being really sensitive to risk, and also upset about the technicalities of grant funding. And I'll give you a quote on the last one in a minute. But the picture is from that you can see is from one of the Young Foundation activities, which was a Pokemon card where you sort of said, well, what are your strengths and weaknesses in relation to the transition? You can see in the middle, somebody's put, finding jobs for my family will bring us more chances to save the planet. That was a very loud sneeze from someone. Not sure you know your mic's on, Amy, but finding jobs for my family will bring us more chances to save the planet and transition to net zero. I think that's really telling because for them, then net zero feels like for something for people with jobs, not them. And then at the end, you can see my household is happy to use solar panels, and then it's their superpower, and their resistance is the landlord will resist us from that or for that. So I think the first part of the list is quite obvious here. My list of what, not being able to make investments and so on. But I think the quote it refers to the last part, people being upset about technicalities of grant funding. And this participant said, they say, oh, well, we're going to give you nearly 2/3 to call it 6,000. Yeah, we'll give you 4,000 quid. They're talking about a grant scheme. But how many people have got that £2,000 in a bank account? It's like a false promise. So quite often these schemes that to encourage people to do things require some form of upfront investment, and clearly in this case it's not going to be possible. And actually, I mean that's becoming increasingly the case in the context of inflation, in the context of post-austerity. There's a quite a large proportion of households that are going to really struggle to make these kinds of those kinds of investments. Then maybe the grant should have just been for 6 grand to the household without making them pay anything towards it. Okay, so just for the last bit, I wanted to sort of talk through how we might use some of this in terms of designing policy and practice. And first starting from the sort of conceptual perspective and then starting from the empirical perspective. This is not necessarily something we've written out quite so clearly in any of our papers, but it's something that I'm really fascinated with. And one of the things I'm really fascinated with is social participation, because I think so we've defined this, drawing very strongly on BSEM, as being able to take part in common social activities and having meaningful social roles, being able to engage in cultural and leisure activities. So that might mean these things: caring for others, maintaining relationships, having fun, following life interests. This came out really strongly in our data as a key point of interest for people. And this is one of the ways in which the whole agenda felt quite threatening, in the sense of, well, I need to go and, living in Leeds, I need to go and look after my mum in Sheffield every week. And I have to have the car to do that because the train's too expensive. These kinds of, those were the things actually that came into conversation a lot of the time. And it doesn't get talked about hardly at all in the environmental social science literature. So in terms of who's at risk here of not being taking through those steps that I had earlier on in my simplified diagram, in terms of not being able to participate socially, if we're thinking about a context in which people are traveling around a lot less, and because of the carbon cost of mobility, effectively, people with limited physical mobility are at risk, people in poorly connected neighbourhoods, all these people listed here, but also people who don't feel safe with active travel or public transport options, for instance. So there's a kind of you start to see a wider range of threats that need to be addressed in some way. And then I think rural low-income communities and peripheral communities are then also likely to be infrastructurally excluded effectively. And then if we start to think about the additional social participation risks of net zero, this is in the conceptual paper actually, and I won't go into it in huge detail. Don't worry about the full slide, but maybe then if I pull out, the middle one there, urban and suburban urban and suburban areas being better connected than remote rural areas and more likely to enable active travel. So being in a poorly connected place will put you at more risk of exclusion from a social participation perspective. And so thinking, and that's kind of an obvious one, less obvious, maybe the last one in the table, that we could be looking at increasingly insular communities as a result of this, right? So we could be looking at a return to the sort of communities that we had, which were really kind of marginalizing for outsiders, potentially increasing sexism, homophobia, and racism as a result of that. And I think that's really, really important to think through, obviously, for obvious reasons. In terms of the opportunities for inclusive policy here, when we're talking particularly about social participation, so I think we need better social infrastructure in communities, and I think that quote from the woman that's talking about having to travel to get her kids the opportunities to develop, or even just to have fun in leisure opportunities. Neighbourhood planning becomes really important, and as a slightly tongue-in-cheek image, the idea of 15-minute neighbourhoods becomes really relevant too. The controversy about this is for good reason, right? I mean, I can understand why people object to this kind of idea, but the reality is that if we did have good provision of the various services that people need in hyper-local places, that would really help people in terms of living more sustainably. And right now, those opportunities are not at all evenly distributed. And I'll leave it at that for that slide. If we start more empirically, so starting from the idea of housing and home, we know that there's a sort of plan to upgrade buildings and reduce energy use from buildings, and that the risks of exclusion that presents is there are very specific worries around high cost of retrofit, people having the ability to change home, and we talked about that with relation to people being private rented or social rented even. And then the knowledge and skills being available locally to do that work, and other risks around ventilation and heating all kind of add up to presenting even more kind of challenges there associated with housing and home and that transition, and who's able to participate in it and who isn't. This is a bit more well rehearsed through the fuel poverty world and energy efficiency and housing world and so on. But then in terms of opportunities for more inclusive policy for housing and home, we might be wanting to think about faster implementation of renovation and retrofit, particularly for those on low incomes, including social housing tenants. Also thinking about the intersection with health, both mental and physical, and people with additional needs for energy in doing that work. As well as providing that sort of more widespread support for other life changes for people, because it's not just about kind of getting the fabric right, it's also about getting people in that fabric to be able to live more sort of low energy and but healthier and happier lives as well. So in conclusion, we think the net zero agenda does offer real opportunities for progressive change, but those opportunities aren't going to happen by magic. They have to be done in a very deliberate way. And we think that an inclusive just transition requires this sort of very proactive, progressive, well-designed, forward-thinking, cross-departmental policy. And that's a recognition I think that is now being reflected in government. I was talking recently to Department for Net Zero, who were telling me that they have a committee that sits across government that is looking at net zero across the piece, so including the Department for Transport, MHCLG, and so on. We also think that place-based and people-central policy is really essential, because the problem looks really different in different places, depending on the housing stock, depending on the kinds of people that live there. Who's there? Are there more people from a particular ethnic minority? Are there more people from that are more likely to be on low incomes, and so on and so on? And all these things will shape whether people can be included or not. And then very finally, I just wanted to finish by plugging our book, which comes out towards the end of middle of next year, I think, and that's has been led by me and Kaz. Kaz is at York, Carolyn Snell at York, published by Bristol University Press. It's called Just Climate Futures, and it kind of captures the whole story, I think, of our work for the Nuffield Foundation. And then the second thing is the Joined Up Sustainability Transformations Centre, led by Sherilyn McGregor at University of Manchester. We start in February. Really keen to get people engaging with us from the start. We have a launch event in March, I think. So if people are interested, let us know. And there we're really thinking the point of joined up sustainability transformations is kind of joining up that interest in social inclusivity and sustainability and climate effectively. I can say more about that if anybody wants to hear more. I'll leave it there for now. So thank you very much for listening. And just to point out that Kaz and I have written the 2 papers together. So she's the lead author on the book. I'm the lead author on the 2 papers, but we work very closely together towards this. And I wanted to give her full credit for that.
Great. Many thanks, Lucy. That was a fantastic talk and a really fascinating project. We're all giving you a virtual round of applause. This is where it's a bit frustrating that we're not in person, because there's a silence in response to your presentation. Maybe if you could you stop, well, now that people have had a chance to look at that, if we stop sharing the screen, then we can see, oh, that's a nice photo. We can see each other.
Hold on. I thought
it's very appropriate. Green.
It's my son.